Hello everybody. In this video we're going to talk about threats and promises. And specifically we're going to talk about the issue of credibility in relationship to threats and promises. So please consider the first game. So player 1 can pick A or B, and then player 2 can pick what I've labeled threat or X. Now, if you see the equilibrium the way we would normally solve it, we'd solve it backwards. Player 2, if player 2 got here, would say, well, look, my choice is between 0 or 1. I'm going with the 1. So player 2, she gets here, should pick X. Player 1 should realize, well, A gives me 5 automatically, but B, well, that'll be responded to with X, and I get 7. So B is better than A, and the players, if they're rational, should end up at the 7-1. But imagine that there's cheap talk before this game, and player 2, doesn't like ending up here, would much rather end up there. So player 2 goes to player 1 and says, don't you dare play B, because if you play B, I am going to play threat. So player 2 threatens to play threat. And indeed, if player 1 believed the threat, player 1 believed that B would be met with threat, player 1 would play A, and that would make player 2 much better off. So it is in player 2's interest to convince player 1 that, her threat is credible. But if player 2 is rational, and it's common knowledge that player 2 is rational, the threat isn't credible, because once player 2 gets a chance to move, player 2 will pick X. Interestingly, if there's a way player 2 could bind herself, she could commit that if she got here, she would no longer have freedom of action, and she would automatically take this path, then player 1 would pick A. Similarly, if player 2 could somehow convince player 1 that player 2 was irrational in a way that would cause her to play threat, that would make player 2 better off. But if it's common knowledge that player 2 is rational, the threat won't be credible. A threat isn't credible if it will not be in your interest to carry it out. So at the cheap talk stage of the game, before we start, it is in the interest of player 2 to convince player 1 to believe player 2's threat. But the threat isn't credible because when player 2 gets a chance to actually move, it's not in her interest to do it. Now let's go to the second game. In the second game, player 1 can again pick A or B, and now player 2 has the ability to pick promise or X. But, if we solve the game backwards, the way we normally do for these kinds of games, we would notice that player 2 gets here, her choice is between 7 and 9. She goes for the 9 and picks X. Player 1 would say, well, B is met with X, gives me 0, I'm going with A, and I'm going to be getting 5. Again, let's imagine that there's a cheap talk stage. So before the game starts, player 2 has the ability to talk to player 1. You can imagine player 2, it says, no, please don't play A. If you play B, I absolutely promise to play promise. And if this promise was believed, player 1 would pick B to get 7 rather than 5. And interestingly, if this promise was believed, both player 1 and player 2 would be better off. But this promise, similar to that threat, is not credible, because once player 2 moves, it will not be in her interest to carry out the promise. A promise is only credible if, when you have a chance to do it or not, it's going to be in your interest to carry it out. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about not practical, but real life applications of this concept. Thank you for listening.